full time here, and Newcastle United have beaten Manchester United 4-1 to go fourth in the Premier League, and what a performance it was in the second half. Really good win, men against boys in the end, and all of those problems that Newcastle were coming into this game hoping to exploit, they really did in that second half. Their pressing was on point, which it wasn't really before half time. They shut down everything in the midfield, they didn't allow any counter-attacks as the game went on, and that really set the tone for a victory that I don't want to say expected, because you should never expect to beat Manchester United like this, but the build-up was all about how Newcastle could overall Manchester United, if Manchester United could contain them and could deal with them at St James's Park, given how raucous they can be when they're at their best. And ultimately that was the story of the game for me, is that Newcastle in the second half pushed on in a way that they hadn't in the first half, and actually that's a big plus point. I stood here after the Brentford game and talked about how it was good that they won the game in the way that they did, because they previously struggled to break down low blocks and deal with games where they don't overall teams. They needed their best players to step up and to play well, and that hadn't really happened in that game, but they came through it. And in this game, a big storyline of this season has been the fact that Newcastle don't tend to perform particularly well in second half of games, and they drop off when they've played well in the first half. It was kind of the opposite in this game. I thought that, given that Eddie Howe wasn't on the touchline, we all hope that he gets well soon. That was a sort of concern that I had, was how they were going to rally in the second half, but they came out and scored a second goal through Harvey Barnes, and then never looked back. And actually Harvey Barnes, who is one of the focuses on the 4-4-2 piece, really came into his own in this game. I thought a player who has done a lot of in terms of statistics and scored a lot of goals and assisted a lot of goals, but he's failed to really make position his own against Anthony Gordon. And I think a really huge part of that is down to work rate and his ability to press and harry teams in the way that Gordon does. Barnes has never really brought that, and lots of fans have actually questioned what Barnes brings when he isn't scoring any goals. But in this game he scored goals, but also pressed from the front and forced himself onto the game, and he was, for me, the driving force in what took the game away from Manchester United. I thought, to their credit, tactically, actually, Ruben Amorim was kind of spot on in the first half. He really focused on Tino Livramento. Alejandro Garnacho and Diogo Dalot did really well, and that's what led to their equalising goal at a point where Newcastle had actually gained the initiative in the game, really, for the first time. They scored that fantastic goal from Sandro Tonali, and then they looked like they were going to be rampant, and suddenly a goal against the run of play, and at half time you're thinking, can Newcastle rally, can they go again? But they did, and Manchester United didn't really have an answer for it after half time. But as I say, credit to Amorim, because that 3-4-3 in the wing-back situation really gave them a foothold in the game. They were very dangerous on the break, and Joshua Zirkzee, I didn't realise how big he is, how strong, how much of a unit he is. Newcastle United fully deserved the victory after the break, but Manchester United did have that moment, and there was a point, and the atmosphere was a little bit flat. And again, you're wondering whether Newcastle can rally through this, because in the past they've struggled. This is where they've struggled. They've either turned up and won the game, and the atmosphere has been bouncing and they've driven them on to victory, or they've struggled to react. But actually in this game they did. They set themselves up really well and fully deserved the victory in the end. And again, another moment for Sandro Tonali. I'll never tire of praising him, but a really great goal. But I think the thing about Tonali for me is just how much of an engine he has. Just before Newcastle took the lead, he raced through against and dispossessed Zirkzee in the area from absolutely nowhere, because Zirkzee had turned the defence and was running, bearing down on goal, and it would have been 2-1 at that point. Who knows what would have happened in this game? As I say, it was right at the start of the second half when there was all these questions about Newcastle's performance going into half-time, whether they could react. Tonali makes that interception, and Newcastle scored from there and really built from there and didn't really look back, and it was a fantastic performance from then. But I do want to mention Barnes again, because I think him and Livramento, I wasn't here for the Brighton game, but once Anthony Gordon got sent off in that game, and then the news that Lewis Hall was going to be injured for the rest of the season going into the cup final, how Newcastle were going to go into Wembley and win that game before then coming back to challenge for the Champions League places. But that's so far away now, that feels so long ago, because Livramento and Barnes have worked together so well. Barnes has become a better player in Eddie Howe's system, worked out a way how to play in this team similar to Gordon without losing that goal threat, without losing that nous for scoring goals. And as I say, the first goal was very much a typical Harvey Barnes goal, in the same way that his goal at Leicester was on Monday. The second one really sums up that improvement. As I say, he led that press, he stormed through and finished it absolutely brilliant. From that point, it was olays all over, and it was, Bruno Fernandes was jeered off the pitch, and it was a sort of party time atmosphere that Newcastle had really hoped to have in this game. But for long periods, it wasn't like that. 4-1 looks like a comprehensive victory, and it was in the end. In the second half, there was only one team in it, but they had to battle, they had to show their mettle, and they had to show that they wanted this. And suddenly, they look like a team that can win in so many different ways at the right time of the season. Jason Tindall said in his press conference on Friday that Newcastle are in the position that they really wanted to be in, and I think that's the big thing that you've got to remember. This is the dream scenario for Newcastle. After the cup final, was fears again that they would drop off naturally because they'd already reached that zenith. They've already broken that duck. They've had that celebratory moment. The city's parties for 2 weeks. Could they come back against Brentford and win the game? Yes, they could. Leicester came along and it was a very comprehensive game. But Manchester United always promises to be different, even when Manchester United aren't the team of old, because of that sort of rivalry and the edge that this game has. They had to be at it, and Manchester United, as I say, in the first 20-25 minutes, tactically they didn't allow Newcastle to get into their rhythm. Newcastle didn't overawe them as we hoped that they would, and then they gained more of a foothold as it went on, and were certainly a threat on the counter-attack. And as I say, it was the first time I thought Amorim's system of 3-4-3 was actually working, and Garnacho was really dangerous in that sort of number 10 role, which he hasn't really shown in recent weeks. For Manchester United, that might be a building block, but it doesn't feel like it now, because they've come away from this game men against boys, and ultimately it's another example of how this team, this Newcastle United team, is light years ahead in terms of culture, in terms of intensity, in terms of plan, in terms of direction. Everything about Newcastle feels like they're going to qualify for the Champions League at the moment. They have to go again on Wednesday with that huge game against Crystal Palace. It's a cliche to say every game, as I said on Twitter earlier. You can't really make a point of that because every game is massive now. It feels like you need a win in all these games, especially going to Aston Villa away from home next week. Win against Palace, and that'll be a difficult game. They've been they've been a real threat away from home in recent weeks. Obviously a slip up against Southampton in that draw, and then a pretty disappointing defeat against Man City, having led 2-0. But they are a threat on the counter-attack in many ways that Manchester United were. They've got pace to get in behind Newcastle, whose defence is still ageing and everything, and I think ultimately that's going to be a really difficult task for Newcastle. But they've shown in the last two games that they can more than match every opponent that comes here. This is a really difficult place to go for anybody at the moment, and Newcastle fully deserve this victory, as I say. More reaction to come tomorrow with my piece for 442 and Forbes as well. Not likely to be at the Crystal Palace game, so I'll be back against Ipswich in a couple of weeks. Thanks so much for joining me. Like, share and subscribe if you want more of this content, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.
And enjoy the remainder of the weekend.